anything about Rivendell, Rivendell has a model of life-on-life faculty with the students. It's a discipleship-based education, right? We're after wisdom here. And so the reason we have Dr. Nelson coming into Rivendell is really for a little bit larger purpose to offer some authoritative input into our Cosmos semester of mathematics, physics, and biology. And he's specifically here to teach on biology. But all along the way, and so far in the history of Rivendell, there have been faculty who have been working with the students daily. And so I'm going to just have Dr. Miller, who is actually one of the faculty for the class that Dr. Nelson is speaking to right now, come up and just introduce Dr. Nelson this evening. So perhaps it's the other faculty here. Is your, perfect. Jeff is also the other faculty that works with Dr. Miller. Typically, we have two faculty working with a whole group of students all the way through the 16 months. So those are the two faculty that Dr. Nelson is here specifically working with and their group of students. So this evening, I'd like Dr. Miller to come and introduce our speaker.
Well, Dr. Paul Nelson and I go way back to about 24 hours ago. We met. He is a philosopher of biology. He's the first philosopher of biology I've ever met. And he's the nicest of all of them. He's been involved with intelligent design debate internationally for about over 2 decades. He received his bachelor in philosophy with a minor in evolutionary biology from the University of Pittsburgh. So many of the Penn State folks out there. And he then attended the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD in philosophy of biology and evolutionary theory. He is currently a fellow at Discovery Institute, where he's been a fellow for quite a few years, I think, and an adjunct professor at the Master of Arts program in Science and Religion at Biola University. He is involved and has been involved as an organizer of the Mirror Creation Conference. He has research interests in the relationship between developmental biology and our knowledge of the history of life, in the theory of intelligent design, and in the interaction of science and theology. He lectures frequently at colleges and universities throughout the US and Europe, and has written extensively, published in scholarly journals and books. He is married to one wife, Suzanne, who is a pediatric physician at Northwestern University. He has 2 daughters who are off abroad. One is Ecuador to study abroad currently, and one with a really difficult task of doing marine biology research in Fiji currently. Tahiti. And I also discovered recently that the only sport that he was ever good at was ice hockey. And we know that he's really sacrificing tonight because his Blackhawks are playing while he's speaking with us tonight. So if anybody wants to flash update to the score to him, they'd probably be happy to do that so long as the Blackhawks are winning. He currently resides in Glenville, Illinois. We please give a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Nelson.
All right. Thank you for coming out on this cold evening. I find it hard to believe that it's actually April 21st. And they're still coming down, but after all, this is Minnesota. I'm going to talk tonight about a couple of issues. One is, what is the range of views that are open to Christians in considering origins? Jason already alluded to that. But then I'm going to move on and ask, how could we, as Christians, but as thinkers generally, so there may be people here tonight who are not Christians, so glad to hear it. How can we engage these issues in a culture that has defined science in a particular way to exclude intelligent design. Now, that definition of science would not have been recognizable to Charles Darwin himself as a young man. When Charles Darwin set sail on the Beagle, he was a creationist. So evolutionary theory itself was born in a Christian cradle. It was born in a theistic cradle. And the history of science in Western culture, going back to the scientific revolution itself, gives a clear and unmistakable evidence that good science was done in a framework where intelligent design was not only a live possibility, but was actually considered the best explanation for what we consider. So I want to come at these two questions, which are related, they have to be related, by considering really how intelligent design has come now into popular discussion and scholarly discussion over the last 20 years. Unfortunately, there are myths that have come to be associated with this idea. We need to challenge those. So, in engaging these two questions, what is the range of views that a Christian can consider? How should we engage the question of culture that's excluded design? I want to answer both of those by looking at these myths. So, here's the first one. Intelligent design is simply creationism relabeled. Relabeled for the 21st century. Second myth, science does not need and cannot use notions like intelligence in genuine explanation. The last myth is intelligent design is simply God behalves reason. In other words, there's a puzzle that we have in our understanding of nature, and before science has a chance to mature and develop and fill that puzzle with material knowledge, intelligent design is jammed into the gap. Inevitably, on this view, science moves forward, and the designer has to evacuate that space. He's given his pink slip, and the address of the Cosmic Unemployment Office. So these three myths are very widely shared. If we jumped in a bus right now and went over to the University of Minnesota, chances are the science faculty there would hold one or all of these myths in their thinking when they think about intelligent design. So let's evaluate the first one. Intelligent design is simply creationism renamed. All right, so here's a can of soup, probably familiar to you. I guess it's in case of chicken noodle, I'm not really sure. In any case, the first myth says you've just changed the label, but it's the same old stuff inside the can, right? Creationism wasn't selling very well, so changed the name to intelligent design, maybe you can move a few more cans off the shelf, but really nobody is fooled. It's the same stuff all along. Now, that's actually not true, and it's not true in a very interesting way. So to approach that first myth, I want to consider a way of thinking about the range of possibilities that one can hold in looking at the question of origins by drawing on the work of a colleague of mine, Marcus Ross, who is a paleontologist at the University of Virginia. And when he was still a PhD student at the University of Rhode Island, finishing his dissertation, he wrote a really interesting and influential paper called Who Believes What? What he discovered is there's a way of arranging all the views out there, views of evolution, materialistic evolution, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism. There's a way of classifying all these views to give us taxonomy that's really very helpful, and you can do so by asking a series of focused questions about the features of those views. So here's the first question. Is the design of nature you perceive real, right, or only apparent? You can answer that two ways. Depending on how you answer it will place you in one position or another in the classification. The second question, can you detect the design? You might perceive it, but can you actually detect it as a matter of science? The next question, agency. Let's suppose we say the design is real and detectable. Was the agent that caused the design corporeal, like me, right? Got about 260 pounds of almost ever. I'm very corporeal, a little more corporeal than I would like to be, frankly, or non-corporeal. Is the agent intrinsic to the universe, that is within the physical universe, or transcendent? Going on with agency, if the agent is transcendent, did that agent act only at the beginning of the universe to set it in motion, set up the laws of nature and set the universe in motion, which would be a deistic conception of design? Or did the agent not only cause the universe to come to be, but then continue to interact with it? Which is, I think, for a biblical view, that would be a theistic conception of design. Another question. Among living things, now focusing just on life on this planet, is there one tree of life that's continuous, the first common ancestors of all of us and all other organisms? That single tree picture that Darwin gave us? Or is the pattern discontinuous, where there isn't a single tree, but in fact a forest of trees, where living things have different starting points? Lastly, what's the age of the Earth? 4.5 billion years, which is the standard geological view? Or is it very much younger than that, 6 to 10,000 years old, which is the view that most young Earth creationists hold by definition? All right. You take those questions and you can use them diagnostically and direct them at any particular view that's out there about origins. And what you end up with is a matrix of possibilities and opinions. So you can take the 7 questions that I just asked and score them this way. By the way, this technique is also used to classify animals in cladistics. It's a method within biological systematics for classifying animals. We can score those questions on this matrix and then use this to build a taxonomy. And it looks like this. So materialist evolution is what's called the outgroup. This is the position that is the furthest out from a design type view. Okay, but then you have a range of other views that end up falling into this branching pattern. Just want to make sure my connections are tight here. Flashing a little bit there. Now, all of the views here, except that there's an interesting organization to life that needs to be explained. So that's true of all of them. But it turns out that intelligent design actually doesn't end up in the right-hand column anywhere, because intelligent design actually captures these 6 views. Okay, so when you do the taxonomy, it turns out intelligent design is actually a generic label for all of these different positions. So if you tell somebody, I accept intelligent design, you actually have quite a range of options that you can consider in terms of the particular details of your view. That's interesting. What that means is that intelligent design as a research community has the potential for a lot of very, very fruitful interaction and disagreement among a range, not just of views on the age of the Earth, but views about the nature of the designer, views about whether he, she, it is within or outside the universe. That's quite a spectrum of opinion, but intelligent design is actually true as a description for all of them. Now, what this tells us about the first myth is it's actually false, historically and descriptively, to say that intelligent design is simply creationism renamed, because in fact, only these 2 views are properly described as creations. The other 4 are not. The diversity of opinion within the position of intelligent design is considerably greater and broader than creationism. And that's because this distinction, you'll see this now, this slide 3 or 4 times throughout the talk, this distinction doesn't belong to any particular religious or philosophical view. Every human being who has to negotiate their daily life, right, uses this distinction all the time. And ordinarily, we do not collapse intelligence as a cause into natural causes. I'll come back to that in more detail in just a minute. But you could be a Buddhist, an agnostic, an atheist, a Christian. It doesn't really matter. You're going to use this distinction between so-called natural causes, where the underlying reality is physics, not a mind. You're going to use natural causes and intelligent causes to explain and understand the world, whatever your particular philosophical or religious view happens to be. So we can go back actually before the birth of Christ. There's not a Christian on the planet Greek philosophy and find they, intelligent writer, poet, and philosopher, 45 years before the birth of Christ, in his great work on the nature of God, of the gods, describes a debate between a Stoic and an Epicurean philosopher about whether design versus no design best explains the world. In fact, Cicero uses a familiar metaphor you've probably used yourself on occasion. He says, imagine taking all the letters of the alphabet. Now, for him, it would be the Latin. It's merely the English alphabet. Take all the letters of the alphabet, lots of them, you put them in a box, and shake it, and dump it out on the ground. And Cicero asks, would that action, would that give you a line of poetry, or even a single word? He says, of course it wouldn't, because a random process like that does not generate information. That argument, made 45 years before the birth of Christ, is present today in intelligent design debates, with the continuity running back thousands of years. Now, Cicero himself was not a Christian. He wasn't embedded in the Abrahamic tradition of religion. Nevertheless, he found design persuasive and something that one could argue about in relation to the evidence. Greek philosophy, really hundreds of years before Christianity, was engaged with this question directly. Does intelligence or mind better explain the world than strictly physical causes, without the authority or presence of any sacred text? Gibbon Sedley, who's a professor at Cambridge University of Ancient Philosophy, in a wonderful book published in 2008, points out in the introduction that this debate among ancient Greek philosophers doesn't require you to pick up the Bible, if you will. In fact, writing really to American readers who tend to be embedded in this debate within our particular cultural context, by the Scopes trial, and what can you teach in public schools, and how do you interpret Genesis 1 to 11. And Sedley says, look, forget about all that. It may matter to you in your particular cultural setting, but the fact is these questions about design belong to all of humanity. You can find them in Greek philosophy long before Christianity. In my travels around the world to address this question, I'm often in settings where the people I'm interacting with don't know what they think about the Bible. In some cases, they're frankly not interested at all, but they care passionately about whether intelligence or mind explains the world, or is it strictly a physical product. So, the first myth, intelligent design is simply creationism remade, is false. Humans, throughout history, going back deep into antiquity, have used these notions of mind, intelligence, and agency to explain and understand the world for as long as we've existed. Which brings us to the second myth, which says science does not need, you cannot use the notion of intelligence in explanation. All right. Let me introduce the second myth by way of a little parable. We've got two artisans. Fizzik is one, Teleo is the other, and they share a workshop. And they have been working together for a long time. They work for a king. And Teleo has the practice of using not just his tools, but when Fizzik will let him, he uses Fizzik's tools as well to work on whatever project he's involved in. Fizzik, by contrast, will use only his own tools. He won't use any of Teleo's tools. He doesn't recognize them. He simply ignores them, in fact. So they're working happily together for years until Fizzik wakes up one day, gets the idea in his mind that he doesn't want Teleo using Teleo's own tools. So Fizzik goes to the king, and he says, you know, Your Highness, I've shared this workshop with Teleo for a long time. Teleo uses his tools and mine, but I don't recognize his tools. I don't think they're valid. So I want you to tell Teleo he's not allowed to use those tools. And Fizzik manages to persuade the king to do this, to pass a law, to create a dictum, if you will, that the only tools that can be used in that workshop are the ones that belong to Fizzik. And Teleo is forbidden to use his tools. Now that's a little parable, but actually reflects what has happened in science since the Darwinian Revolution. As I told you at the beginning, Darwin set sail on the Beagle as a creationist. The book that he said taught him the most at Cambridge University was William Paley's Natural Theology, which is an argument from biological evidence to the existence of a designer. This is the rule that exists now in science that Darwin himself would not have recognized because it didn't actually apply when he was a young man. The statements of science must invoke only natural things and processes. It's the best, pithiest, short formulation of a principle about how science is to be conducted. Now, it turns out that this rule is much more important in the debate about origins than any evidential question, because this tells you what counts as evidence. I'll give you a non-science parallel. It tells you how old I am, which is really sad. But I remember the NBA before the three-point shot, right? When I was a kid, any field goal in basketball scored 2 points, but the NBA decided that the game was getting boring, and it's a beautiful thing to see a long shot arcing through the air going through the hoop. But if you're going to ask players to take the risk of shooting a long shot, you have to reward them for making it. So the NBA said, put a line on the floor, a certain radius away from the basket. If you're on that line or behind it, and you shoot and you score, you get 3 points. And now the game is more interesting and more beautiful. I'd love to see a long three-pointer, and those of you who are basketball fans, I'm sure feel the same way. Making the rules of basketball is not playing basketball, right? There's a fundamental difference that's there. In fact, I'll give you a hockey parallel. In the 1980s, the game of professional hockey in the NHL was boring. It was slow and dull, and you would have games that were 0-0 after 3 periods. Because people were holding, there was a lot of holding, there was a lot of mischief going on, and we had no two-line passes, which makes the game slow and dull. And the NHL changed the rules to allow two-line passes, so now you can pass the puck in a really dramatic way. Most of the sheet of ice makes for a great play, and holding, in particular, is called all the time. The game is faster and more interesting now, but there is a difference between making the rules of the game and playing the game. This makes the rules of science. Once you accept this rule, it changes how you actually see evidence. So it ends up being much more fundamental and important than the evidence itself. So what happens is that goes away, and this becomes your toolkit. Notice this even if I were an atheist, and again, I'll point out, this distinction, there's no agent down here now, we're taking the agent away. This distinction between intelligence and physics is ubiquitous in human affairs. Everybody uses it all the time. I'll give you an example. Imagine you are called to jury duty, you were put on a jury panel for capital crime, right? Something really serious like a rape or a murder. And the defendant is sitting there, and the defense counsel has his case, and he's able to show you, using medical data, x-rays, testimony from experts, that the accused had a brain tumor that affected his voluntary action, that affected the part of the brain that controls voluntary action. What the defense is doing is he's saying, that guy's actually not responsible for what he did. He didn't freely choose it. There's in fact a physical explanation for what he did. His actions were affected by a brain tumor that wasn't his responsibility. In a case like that, you as juror are likely to find him innocent, because what you say is, this is a bright, clear line between these two. Intelligence presupposes freedom of will, freedom of action. If that's taken away, and there's a physical explanation, I can't hold him accountable because I recognize that once physics takes over, free action
moral responsibility go away. So that's an example from criminal law, but you can think of plenty of others where you don't collapse these two together. We in fact recognize intelligence by its freedom from physical necessity. So here's a even sort of simpler way to think about this. Imagine you are go to the audience of a game show, Southern California, in a movie studio or TV studio, okay? And you know how The Price is Right works, or one of those game shows. You're called down to the front to be a participant, to be a contestant, and behind this door is a puzzle. Now, you as contestant are offered a choice of solutions to the puzzle. We'll win you the prize if you get it right. Okay? You can have box one, and in box one are thousands of solutions, all of type X. Okay, they all have the same form. I'll come explain what that is in just a moment. You can have box one, or you can have box two. Now, the great thing about box two is if there's a type 1 solution in box one, right, you get it in box two as well. So at that point, with respect to those type X solutions, you're not going to lose anything. Answers in there, you get it in here as well. But you also get the type Y solutions. No one in this room is going to take box one over box two the way I've described it. Even if you only have to call on this once or twice, you've got more explanatory horsepower in box two because you have a greater range of options depending on what the puzzle is behind that door. An atheist or an agnostic, as I've described this puzzle, would take box two because they have a greater range of possibilities depending on what the puzzle is. So let's look at some real puzzles. And by the way, if you know what these are, don't say. Give other people a chance to think about them. Does anybody recognize that? Anybody had mineralogy? Some of you may be wearing on your wrist a very, very small version of this. It's quartz. Okay? I can give you the recipe for quartz. You can grow it. Watch manufacturers grow great big vats of these crystals because they have the wonderful property when they're made the right size that if you put electric current through them, they oscillate at a very high frequency, and you can step that frequency down and run a quartz watch. There's a perfectly good physical explanation for quartz. Like I said, I can give you the recipe. You can actually grow quartz crystals for yourself. So at this point, our two boxes are equivalent because physics handles the problem. And by the way, I'm using physics as a shorthand for any explanation where there's a causal process involved that doesn't include a mind or an intelligence. How about that? Now, I won't do this tonight, but I've asked audiences for a show of hands, how many people think these are artificial? And to me, they look like they were turned on a lathe, right? Beautiful little black glassy buttons, perfectly symmetrical, like someone manufactured them. Typically about half the audience thinks they're artificial. In fact, these are tektites, and they're caused by meteoritic impact, okay? So when tektites were first discovered, there was a decades-long debate about whether they were natural or artificial. Currently, the best explanation for the origin of tektites is a meteor hits the ground, very high speed, and creates a molten mass, a molten melt that throws off these molten glassy globules. And as they fall through the air, they cool. Okay, so here's a little cartoon of this happening. It's falling through the air and it's cooling, and the air is pushing up from below, cooling it off, and you get that beveled edge that you saw in the photograph. And then, of course, the whole thing cools and it falls to the ground. And you find them. They look like beautiful little glassy buttons. As I said, when they were first discovered, there was a long debate about whether someone made them or whether they were natural objects. Even to have that debate at all, you have to have the possibility of intelligent design in your toolkit. How about that? Now, it's kind of hard to see from this angle, but if I handed this to you, you would see that the edges taper beautifully all the way around. And if you turned it edge on, you would see that they form a cutting surface. And this would fit very comfortably in your hand. And if you found it in an archaeological site, you'd have evidence of human habitation. It's a hand axe. Now, I don't have the right training to recognize that as a hand axe. My wife and I were in central Mexico 2 years ago and visiting a pre-Columbian temple site. And I'm walking along the path up to this temple with an archaeologist. And he reaches out his hand and grabs me and he says, "Paul, do you realize what you just stepped over?" I said, "No." I looked down at the ground. It looked to me like just a pebble path leading up to this pre-Columbian temple. And he reaches down and he picks up a piece of pottery that I didn't recognize. I don't have, my cognitive apparatus has not been trained to recognize that. He saw it instantly because his perception was so trained. That requires at least one intelligence for its existence. Physics is not going to work here. You need those type-wise solutions. You need intelligent design, mind, as a causal possibility in your box of possible explanations. And you need it there, whatever your particular religious or philosophical view happens to be. If you want to explain where hand axes come from, you need at least one mind existing thousands of years ago to make that. And here, of course, we don't even need to debate the question. The laws of physics in the early 16th century did not cause that to exist. You can go to the Louvre and see it in the very dark gallery where the French keep it, smiling enigmatically. To explain that pattern, you need the genius of Leonardo. That's the true explanation for how that came to be. Again, physics is not going to do it for you. All right, the moral of the story is, when we understand all the possibilities that are out there, we need this full toolkit. We need intelligence as a kind of cause that cannot be reduced to physics. And I think Einstein understood this. It's often said that Einstein made this statement: everything in science should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. In fact, what he said was something more complicated, but getting to the same point. When you come to understand and explain the world, you don't want your theories to do damage to the world itself. So if the world is simple and elegant, a simple, elegant theory will work for that. When the world is complicated and messy, and you can't reduce it to physics, you need a greater range of possible causes. Because we want our theories to be consonant with nature herself. We don't want to lose anything. One of my advisors at the University of Chicago put it to me this way. He said, "There's no advantage to holding a desert ontology." Ontology is the word in philosophy that refers to what's out there in reality. There's no advantage to holding a desert ontology if you live in a tropical rainforest. Okay? Desert ontologies are nice, clean, and easy to remember. Okay? Not a lot going on there. You've got sand and the sky, and that's about it. They're nice and clean and easy to remember and totally sterile. If you happen to live in a tropical rainforest where you've got macaws and boas and a whole range of different plants and insects, you need a richer ontology to explain that world. Desert ontology will not work, even though it's easy to remember. So my thesis for this evening is science actually loses nothing by allowing for the possibility of design. In fact, it gains tremendously, as I'll demonstrate, but you lose a tool you cannot get back if you exclude design. Because if design is irreducible to physics, if you eliminate it, you can't get it back from physics because physics won't produce it. There's an asymmetry there that's really deep. Exclude design, you're damaging science, and you can't get it back from physics itself. So we can draw a moral from the puzzles. You've heard of Occam's razor. Entities should not be multiplied without necessity. Well, I'm going to take a contrast to that and introduce you to Leibniz's toolbox. There's Leibniz, one of my philosophical heroes, and there is his toolbox right out of Google Images. What's in Leibniz's toolbox, or what's the principle? Don't throw something away if keeping it costs you nothing. Okay, so I actually have, in my house in Glenview, Illinois, I have tools in the garage and I don't know what they're for. And my wife doesn't like it because she tends to like to throw things away, right? Clean up, get rid of it. If you don't need it, get rid of it, it's clutter. I say, honey, I'm not getting rid of that tool because I know the minute I throw it away, the next day or in a week, I'll remember what it's for, and now it's gone in the recycling bin and I can't get it back. Don't throw something away if keeping it costs you nothing, except maybe the garage is a little messy. The corollary for scientific explanation is never throw away a cause you might need to explain the world, especially if you have to sneak it back later anyway, which happens all the time with the notion of design. That's a good toolkit to have. In fact, natural science itself depends on our ability to detect intelligent causation. Let me give you an example of this. It's really quite striking. So a real-life example happened a few years ago. This young physicist, Hendrik Schoen, was on his way to a Nobel Prize in solid-state physics. Okay, he had a string of very high-profile papers in the best journals in the world, like Nature and Science. I remember these publications. They were front-page news in the New York Times because if this work had held up, it would have been worth billions of dollars to corporations. There he is. The crime that he committed against science was so grave, was so serious, that the university in Germany that gave him his PhD took it away. Almost unheard of for that to happen. But what he did was really bad. Okay, he had these high-profile papers. They generated a lot of publicity. And in a situation like that, other researchers will try to replicate the results, especially because there was a lot of money at stake if the results had held up. So other physicists tried to replicate what Schoen claimed to have discovered, and they couldn't do it. Now that's a problem. In science, if I actually discover something, I don't need to be there for that effect to occur, because it's nature herself who's providing it. So if I give you my methods and materials, you should be able to replicate the same effect if it's actually out there in nature. In the case of Schoen, no one could do that. And it was really bothersome. So Bell Labs formed an investigative committee, and they began to look at his papers and compare them one to another. And as soon as they did, they noticed something really strange. Now, what the New York Times has done here is they've taken two of the figures from his paper, two of his papers, and compared them. This diagram is from a paper published in November 2000 on a light-emitting transistor. Okay? This figure is from a paper published in December of the same year on a different kind of transistor. Now, these experiments are using different materials and different setups, yet the curves are largely identical, right down to the noise. Okay, so Times has taken this section of this curve and this section of this curve, and they've blown them up here, and these lines can be superimposed on each other. They're exactly the same. Yet this should have been completely random in both cases. It's noise caused by the instrumentation used to run the experiments. If I gave you a blank sheet of paper right now, and I didn't tell you why, and I asked you to sign your name 5 times, there would be more variation in your 5 signatures than in those 2 lines. Signature is used by banks and the US government uniquely to identify you, because it's a pattern with a very, very small probability. Once you sign your name, that pattern can be used diagnostically to identify you and distinguish you from somebody else, but there would be more variation in your 5 signatures than in those 2 lines. Once that was observed, his career was over. And the committee at Bell Labs said there's no way that those lines could be the same except that he faked his results. Meaning there's no physical explanation for that match except that those were copied by his deliberate intent. So if we put Schoen's figures behind our puzzle door and open it, and we look at our 2 sets of possible solutions, there's no physical story for why that pattern exists. It's not going to work. You need at least one intelligence to explain it. The integrity of science itself, catching fraud in science, depends on our being able to say that pattern does not have a physical cause. You caused it by your deliberate intent. How many people here follow the global warming debate? Anybody? It's hard to avoid it in our culture. This curve is at the start of the global warming debate. Goes from 1960 to 2010, It's called the Keeling curve, and it records atmospheric carbon dioxide over a 50-year span. And you'll notice that it's heading up like this, that the carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere is heading up really in pretty dramatic fashion. There's a sawtooth pattern there because over the course of 1 year, during the winter, more carbon is burned for heating and other purposes, and then it drops off during the summer and then heads back up again in the winters. So that's why we have this sawtooth pattern to the curve. The global warming debate itself rests on any natural process, but human activity of getting fossil fuels like coal and oil out of the ground and burning them has caused this to happen. That this wouldn't exist, this increasing concentration of carbon dioxide would not exist in our atmosphere if we didn't heat our houses and power our cars with gasoline and so forth. So even to have the global warming debate, you have to be able to say that effect requires human agency, human intelligence. It wouldn't exist if we didn't exist, and it wouldn't exist if we didn't deliberately do certain things by our design or intent. So even to have the global warming debate, you have to be able to say, I can distinguish natural causes from causes that require intelligence. Now, a skeptic might say, but Paul, this is all human. You're only dealing with Homo sapiens. You're only dealing with the action of us, of people. Nobody doubts that humans can, fake results or paint paintings and so forth. So let's turn up the philosophical temperature a little bit and consider the SETI program, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So here is the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico, built into a natural depression. Used to look at magnetic radiation, radio waves, sitting at the console in the Arecibo facility. And she is the real-life model for the Jodie Foster character in the movie Contact, which some of you may have seen, or perhaps you've read the Carl Sagan novel Contact. It's about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the caption of this photograph tells you it's 3 a.m. Okay, at 3 a.m. I would have been asleep for 5 hours. These are very dedicated scientists. This is my view of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But it's interesting what they're doing. They're testing software that does pattern detection. And if you read the caption, I know you probably can't see it from where you're sitting, it's interesting what Jill Tarter says. She says, it would be nice if they, meaning ET, if he, she, it is out there, said something obvious like the digits of pi. Now, why would the digits of pi be obvious? Okay? Here are the first, little high school geometry. You remember what pi is. It's the ratio between the circumference of a circle and its diameter. It's a mathematical object. Pi is the same number wherever you go in the universe. And pi, if you think about it, is a truly weird number, okay? There are web pages where you can go and put in your phone number, and your phone number has a position in pi. At this point, only the 7-digit version. If you do your area code plus your phone number, so my cell number is 847-894-3291, I can get 894-3291. I can't get the 847 in front because even though pi has been solved out now to trillions of digits, it's still not big enough to have that 10-digit string, but it will be. As pi gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you're going to find more and more patterns in there, and eventually you'll find things like whole lines of Shakespeare, which if you meditate on it will blow your mind. So I suggest not doing that, okay? I'm telling you, pi is a very strange number. Doesn't repeat as far as we know. In any case, you would not need to see very much of this coming in on a narrowband radio transmission, which is actually the first thing they're looking for. Narrowband radio transmissions are not produced by any natural cause that we know. So if a powerful beam came in, that would be the first indicator of intelligence. But if you saw this, even a little bit of it, you could open the champagne. Why? Because mathematical objects are produced by minds. It's minds that grasp the relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter, and that can generate strings of digits like this. Jill Tarter is an atheist. She's very candid about that. You go on the web and look her up, and she makes clear statements. She says, I'm an atheist, but her research depends on being able to do that sifting. So we put pi in there. And for Jill Tarter to do her research at all, she has to be able to exclude physics. And tell you, she'll probably, even if she does detect something, she'll never get out there to see at the other end what's there. But she would have good, solid grounds to say there's at least one other mind in this universe that doesn't belong to Homo sapiens. Now, at this point, we've left our species. Yet we can still detect design because we have a small probability pattern that's uniquely specified by a mathematical relationship. And as far as we know, that's only produced by intellect, by mind, not by physics. What's in the toolkit of science? It used to be that intelligence was in there. And you know what? It really still is in a way. But let me show you something funny about what's happened over time to the toolkit of science. So here is a physical ontology of what physics would tell you at the time of Christ. This is Aristotelian physics. And you know what? People still flunked their physics exams. Earth, air, water, what's that fourth one? Can't remember. We go to the scientific revolution. Physical knowledge has grown enormously. And then we come to today, and these boxes are obviously not to scale. We know a tremendously greater amount about the world than we did 2,000 years ago. But design itself hasn't changed. So let's put an object in here that was known in the 1st century Common Era. At that time, the island of Britain was becoming a colony of Rome. And Stonehenge was already an ancient arrangement. It was already thousands of years old. Stonehenge is a very, very old arrangement. So you're a Roman centurion, you're riding over the hill. Those of you who have been to the UK and seen Stonehenge on the plain of Salisbury outside Bath, you know it's very dramatic. You kind of come over a hill and you see it there on the horizon. The Roman centurion who saw that, maybe he was a pagan, who knows what he believed, he would have asked himself the question, who built it? Large monoliths like that do not arrange themselves in a pattern that aligns with the summer and winter solstice. It just doesn't happen by physical processes. So in the 1st century Common Era, the inference Stonehenge was designed was true. It was true in 1700, it's true today, it will be true 100 years from now, or indefinitely into the future when our current theories of science and physics are long gone. It turns out that these inferences to intelligence are among the most stable things that human beings know. They don't change. We infer them, they're reliable, and they continue as stable knowledge when science itself is changing all the time. The reason for that is if design as a cause cannot be collapsed to physics, it doesn't matter what physics tells you. That's true, that's true, that's true, depending really not on where you are in the timeline. But you've identified the actual cause for something. So it doesn't matter how big physical knowledge gets, design tracks right along with it. Physical knowledge, I love PowerPoint, right? This can grow indefinitely large, and if design doesn't collapse to physics, it will always have its explanatory power no matter how much we learn about the universe. Because we don't collapse what minds do into what physics does. Which brings us to our final myth. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Not too bad. Intelligent design is just God of the gaps reasoning and intrinsically vulnerable to being overturned by the advance of science. Okay, this is a legitimate worry. It's a legitimate worry because you can always be wrong. It's the problem of induction, right? And the problem of induction day. How many times have you said something like, I never would have gone out with him? No. And I went out with him, but boy, was that a waste of time because he is a blank, right? I wouldn't have voted for him if I knew he was going to raise my taxes. I wouldn't have bought that house if I really understood how vulnerable it was to flooding, et cetera, et cetera. We never know everything we need to know to avoid making mistakes. I wouldn't have parked in that part of the parking lot if I had known that I would have forgotten that particular location. And it took me half an hour to find my car. If it's the case in daily life that you can't avoid mistakes, it's even more the case in science that you can't avoid mistakes. If you're afraid of making a mistake, get out of science. Go into real estate or something else. The greatest scientists of history all committed spectacular blunders. Darwin's theory of heredity wasn't just wrong, it was grotesquely, spectacularly wrong. Kepler made mistakes, Newton made mistakes, Boyle, Pasteur, right down the list. The only way to avoid mistakes in science is to leave the field. So at that point of the problem of induction, yes, you could have a God in the gaps mistake. You could insert a designer into a puzzle for which there's actually a physical explanation. But that's just the price you pay for doing science. So let's push the problem of induction aside, because it applies to everybody, there's no solving it. And think about it this way, not every question we put to nature is going to be answered as we prefer. Now, let me give you an example from outside biology, kind of to bring this home. It's 20 years from now, I'll be well past retirement age, but I'm still healthy. Sitting around in my retirement home, I'm bored. I have a nephew who's working on Mars. We've colonized Mars. There are tens of thousands of people living up there. I know he's up there. So I pick up my 2035 equivalent of an iPhone, punch in his number, and I want to have a chat with him. How's it going on Mars today, right? So I'm back here on Earth. I have a science problem that I want solved, which is this question. Whoops, sorry. How can an Earth dweller communicate in real time with somebody up there? Okay, in a few minutes when we have Q&A, I'll be communicating with you in real time. You'll ask me a question, I'll try to answer, we'll have a nice conversation. It won't be a big lag, right? So here I am on Earth, call my nephew, he's working up there in the lab. I want to have a nice chat with him. And that motivates this question. Now, you know what that question means, right? You can form it as an English sentence and put it to nature and say, I want an answer for that question. I want to fill the gap in my knowledge with some process or mechanism that's got to be out there that will allow me to do this. You can give me any money? Let's say you're an official of the National Science Foundation, and I come to you with a grant proposal to solve this. Now, you're going to tell me to read a textbook on basic physics, right? There is no knowledge out there for the question I'm asking, and it doesn't matter how long I ask the question or try to answer it. Unless we fundamentally don't understand physics, there's no knowledge to put in that gap. So my frustration at wanting to answer that question and fill in that gap comes not from nature, but from me. Okay? At its closest, in the fall, Mars is about 35 million miles away. And there's a speed limit on the propagation of signals through space. There it is, roughly 186,000 miles per second. So I can put his number in and go make myself coffee, feed the cat, go pick up the paper off the driveway, come back in, look at Reddit, check my email. About 6.5 minutes later, I'll hear his voice. It takes over 3 minutes to get out there, and over 3 minutes to get back. We can have a conversation, but it will never be in real time. It's going to be very leisurely. Why? Because this is reality. And if reality doesn't cooperate with your questions, the problem is not with reality, the problem is with you. You're putting the wrong question to nature, and nature will not oblige you by providing knowledge. Okay, so let's come back to biology. Many of the questions that persist in evolutionary theory persist not because we haven't asked the question long enough or tried hard enough. They persist because the question we're putting to nature doesn't correspond to what nature is telling us. So for instance, I want to solve the problem of the origin of life by a natural process. That's the question I'm putting to nature. Let's say I'm an evolutionary theorist working on the origin of life. If the origin of life did not actually arise by a strictly natural process, if it implicates, in fact, intelligence, then I can ask the question all day, and there's no knowledge out there to come back to fill in that gap. The gap actually exists objectively out there in nature. So in many areas of what I'll call the materialist or naturalist program of explanation for the history of life on this planet, like the origin of life, or the origin of functional complexity, or the origin of animals, this is something I think about all the time, the questions that are being put to nature don't actually reflect the evidence, at least as I see it, but the philosophy of naturalism. It's naturalism or materialism that tells you, look for a strictly material process to build the first cell. All you need a mind about. It isn't true. Isn't true. There are no gaps to be filled. They're actually out there in nature. And the healthy thing for a science to do is to recognize the reality of these discontinuities and build your science on them. Don't keep asking the question. And use this toolkit. All right, final example, and then we'll have Q&A. Elliot Sober is a philosopher of science at the University of Wisconsin, and to my mind, the wisest and most insightful critic of intelligent design currently publishing. So if you go to his webpage, he has a whole section of papers critiquing intelligent design that are very thoughtful. If you like the idea of intelligent design, these papers will challenge you. You'll learn a lot from him. I certainly have. So this is the kind of critic to have, somebody who really engages the questions and does so with insight and respect. So I have a high estimation of Elliot. And in fact, he had a lot of influence on me as a young philosopher. So while I was still in college, I read a publication he wrote describing science, in part describing the process of scientific explanation. And in that publication, he points out that knowing what the cause is for some particular puzzle in nature is like knowing where a treasure is buried. And there's a lot to that. Okay, I watch my wife in her medical practice. She comes home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock and tells me about her day. And sometimes she'll come home and she'll be really agitated. I can see it on her face as she comes in from the garage into the kitchen. She's really agitated. And she's agitated because she has a sick child and she doesn't know why. In that situation, that child, that family, and my wife, the doctor, are at the mercy of that illness because they have not identified a cause for the particular problem. Once they know the cause, then they have some hope of control, some hope of treatment, some hope of progress. So it really is like finding a treasure, not just in medicine, but in lots of other areas of science as well. Well, that suggests a helpful model. Okay, so here's our question. What caused X? Some puzzle that we want to explain. Maybe it's the origin of life, maybe it's the origin of humanity. Some puzzle we want to answer. And here's our island with a nice little tree you can take shade under. Now, we're going to search that island for the answer to our question. And let's say the answer, this is like a treasure map, the answer is down at the southern tip, and it turns out that it's intelligent design. So the true explanation for X is it was caused by. And if we had this treasure map, we'd go right down there and we would dig and find the truth and move on. Consider another question. But of course, you don't have treasure maps in science. That's why you have to do science. What we find is a range of possibilities. The truth may be there somewhere, but we don't have a treasure map. We've got to do the hard work of figuring out how nature is operating. Now, what's the practical effect of this question on our search? If the true answer is down there at the southern tip of the island, the practical effect of this philosophy of science is to make a no-dig zone. Even though that's what happened, we've put it out of reach. You can't go down there. The consequence of that is you're going to dig put it out of reach against the answer to bother. This is the worst philosophy of science to have because it puts out of reach the truth before the evidence has a chance to speak for itself. It puts a screen or a wall between. In that case, the evidence is rendered moot, irrelevant, really. It's the worst philosophy of science to have, and I would say that again, even if I were an atheist. Now notice what happens when we take the no-dig zone away. The rest of the island is still open for searching. Every natural process and regularity that God or the designer put in place is there to be discovered. We've just allowed for the possibility of intelligence. That asymmetry, once I can get a scientist to see it, is going to win the day in the long run. Because intellectual freedom is more powerful than we realize. And if you allow for a possibility that doesn't take anything away from the rest of science, you're bound to make discoveries. The no-dig zone takes things away from you that you legitimately should have in your toolkit of explanation. It's out of reach. It's not out of reach there, and you can still look on the rest of the island. Meaning, I've got more intellectual freedom with this than I do with that rule. That's why it's a bad philosophy of science. If life were intelligently designed, we should be free to discover that if that's what actually happened. And if that's what actually happened, and we adopt a naturalistic approach to explanation, we are bound to be frustrated. Because we won't be finding the truth. We'll be searching fruitlessly for something that actually doesn't exist. Okay, that's my last slide. And my timer says 58 minutes, so I'm sorry I went a little long, but we'll take our little mini break now. If people want to leave, they can go, but I would love to have questions from any of you.